Hey, what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and today we are finally going to be talking about Warlock essences for the 8.2 patch Rise of Azshara. Some essences are certain standouts, being much better than others, and then there are some essences like Ripple in Space, which are terrible. If you're interested in any week awaras or add-ons you see here, I'll have a link to my Twitch where I stream 5 to 6 days a week, as well as my Discord in the description where you can find them all. Now we're going to start off reviewing each essence on its own, and then jump into different essence builds that I feel could be strong options for each spec heading into 8.2 and Eternal Palace. Now unfortunately we have not been able to test both major and minor essence combinations together since the first few weeks of PTR, so in a sense this video is a bit speculative, but it's not terribly challenging to see certain essences that are standouts from others. All the essences here are also rank 3, which is one rank below the final cosmetic rank you can reach through various sources of progression. I will also place a link to the most recent Wowhead article covering each essence's rank and where to get them in the description. Condensed Life Force is the first essence that I want to talk about, and it has been surprisingly powerful in the recent testing that I have done with it. It's a 3-minute cooldown that spawns a Guardian of Azeroth. It attacks your target for 30 seconds, with each attack granting you a stacking 2% haste buff, which can stack up to 5 times. You reach 10% haste pretty quickly, and holding that buff for 20 plus seconds in addition to the passive 5% extra damage the minor spike grants you, makes this a pretty strong essence overall. The unfortunate side of this essence is that it is gated behind Eternal Palace progress, and it gains a good bit of value at both rank 2 and 3. We aren't 100% certain as to how the system will function to craft the essence at this point, more so actually how the reliquaries actually drop from bosses and how many you truly need, but hopefully we will know more soon. Baseline compared to the other essences and ignoring other spec-based interactions with them, this appears to be the strongest overall single target essence currently heading into 8.2. Blood of the Enemy is another essence that I had my eye on for a while. However, the rank 3 version was recently nerfed by a pretty good bit. The actual amount of critical hit damage was nerfed from 35% to 25%, and the duration was reduced from a whopping 15 seconds to a mere 5 seconds, which is actually massive. I was a fan of this trait initially for Affliction as a major essence, but after the nerfs and when factoring in the movement the trait brings with it, I don't think it will end up being as powerful as I had initially thought. The recent duration and percent damage nerf only affects rank 3 and above, however, which makes the actual grind to it not as pressing of a matter in a sense. The minor side of it I feel is not a terrible choice, however I personally feel that there are better options available most of the time. Essence of the Focusing Iris is an interesting trait that deals a large amount of damage in a frontal cone over roughly a 3-second channel to all enemies in front of you. While there are certainly better options when it comes to single target damage based essences, this essence could be a real option on certain fights where there are frequent ad spawns like Orozoa in Mythic Eternal Palace, or in Mythic Plus at times. The minor ability it brings with it is not the worst, but it's pretty punishing if you end up swapping targets, and seeing as how the major side of said essence gains value in multi-target scenarios, it might lead to some pretty awkward situations. Memory of Lucid Dreams is certainly a hot topic across the board, and for good reason. The cooldown of the major side of Lucid Dreams was recently reduced from 3 minutes to 2 minutes, which is a pretty big change for one build that we'll be looking at in a bit here. Even for specs that might not be able to take as much of an advantage of the major side, the minor passive that Lucid Dreams grants is also something to take note of. If you pair it with Soul Conduit and a Demonic Meteor Azshara piece for Demonology, you can chain some pretty insane cast sequences back to back. There have been times where I've gone over 45 seconds without casting one Shadow Bolt running that build. Even just pairing it with Soul Conduit can make for some pretty insane shard generation / refunds at times. The only real difference between rank 1 and 2 of the major essence part of this is that rank 2 grants you 3 more seconds of the on-use effect, and rank 3 simply grants you a bit of leech when used. Each minor rank, however, grants additional versatility whenever you refund a soul shard, but thankfully you can acquire Lucid Dreams pretty early on, and it appears to be gated only behind the Nazjatar questline. Purification Protocol is a very interesting essence in itself. It's a placed effect that deals roughly 23,000 damage over 6 seconds to said area. The interesting part about this essence is that whenever an ad dies within the beam, your damage is increased by 10% for 8 seconds. It's also worth making note that the major stuns aberrations, while the minor also brings with it a 50% increased damage against them. Obviously this essence is strong once again when it comes to AoE based situations, and with it being on a 1 minute CD versus focusing Iris being a 1.5 minute CD, it could make it the actual call in certain situations if deemed worthy. I did a bit of research in an attempt to find out what exactly constitutes a specimen deemed worthy by Mother, but sadly was not able to find anything on that proc. Now unfortunately, there's not really much to say about Ripple in Space in PvE based scenarios. The bonus intellect the minor brings you is nice, but we will rarely ever be presented with the chance to proc it. It also does not proc based off of demonic gateway or circle movement, so there's really no way to actually cheese this essence it seems at all. The Crucible of Flame is another essence that surprised me a good bit in testing, being a bit better than I thought it actually would be. It deals moderate damage to your target while bringing with it a dot at rank 2 that burns the target over 6 seconds. At rank 3, the ability actually receives a second charge, which really ramps up its overall damage, especially when taking into account the concentrated flame bonus damage each application grants you. Overall, there really did not seem to be any real tricks that you could do with Crucible of Flame's bonus damage stacks, but I feel it is a pretty decent choice if you're lacking other major essences or for week 1 of 8.2, as it is pretty much given to us right on launch. As mentioned, rank 2 and 3 are where this essence gains a lot of value and can provide a decent bit of burst damage if needed for priority ad spawns or phase pushes, etc. The minor portion of this essence also deals respectable damage, and that was before tonight's hotfixes, which buffed its damage by 35%. The Unbound Force is another essence I tested with extensively over the course of 8.2 raid testing. It has seen its fair share of nerfs, and now, in my opinion, is very underwhelming. You typically want to hold the major half of this essence for when the minor portion reaches 20 stacks and then grants you the 70% bonus critical strike chance. Even with that being factored into the equation, the damage it deals is pretty poor within said window compared to other major essences, and that's not even factoring in the bonus stats or damage taken from the other essences such as Condensed Life Force. The minor has also been nerfed a few times as well at this point, and I feel it's pretty underwhelming also seeing how long it takes you to actually reach 20 stacks. World Vein Resonance is a very interesting trait, and it reminds me a lot of Incandescent Sliver in a sense, just not nearly as annoying. I feel this trait's use is going to depend a lot on the boss mechanics and overall movement, but if you can maintain a high uptime by having multiple members of the group with this major or minor essence, it's most likely one of the strongest overall choices. You can benefit from a max of 4 shards, and they have a range of 12 yards. The interesting part about this essence is that you most likely only need a handful of raiders with this essence as an actual minor, and maybe one of the two as a major to maintain a pretty high uptime and stat count for the group receiving the buff. As mentioned, movement does greatly hinder this essence as a whole, but with 1 or 2 raiders having it as their major essence, you should be able to quickly drop 3 shards right when the movement is complete from 1 raider, and by the time those 3 expire, you should have a few shards from minor procs from random raiders up as well if they're using it as their minor. The same major essence CD can be used for times of bad RNG where the group only has 1 to 2 active spikes, and with it being on a 1 minute CD, it makes it pretty simple to maintain and optimize around it if the fight allows for it. Now the final essence that I want to cover before we get into each spec here is Vision of Perfection. This essence has easily been the most discussed essence over the course of 8.2 PTR, and has received a lot of changes. This essence grants the player a chance to proc a class CD for 35% of its baseline duration, which also brings with it any effects such as Azshara or talents that come with said proc. For Demonology Warlock, it's granting us currently 35% of the baseline intellect that the Supreme Commander Azshara trait gives us upon expiration, as well as 3 soul shards via the Baleful Invocation Azshara trait. It is also extending our supremacy window for destruction if we have an Infernal active, and if we don't, it does bring with it its own supremacy window as well as a full 8 stacks of Crashing Chaos with a minor Vision Perfection based Infernal. There's also a great bit of RNG behind this trait however, so some players might opt for other major or minor essences depending on how they stack up for different specs. The minor side of this vision also brings with it a 13% CD reduction, which makes for some interesting interactions between it and traits like Crashing Chaos or Dreadful Culling, which also reduce cooldown duration. The unfortunate part is that this trait is indeed gated behind Mechagon, which is not open until week 3, but it does seem pretty simple to obtain once it actually arrives. Now I want to reiterate once again here, before we get too far into these spec-specific essences, that actual sims aren't out yet, and these major/minor essence combinations are from my own personal testing over the course of PTR Raid Testing and Proving Grounds. It's pretty easy to see that some traits are much more powerful than others, like Vision compared to Ripple, but some are also very close to one another, and some are pretty RNG based. There's also a bit of time left until 8.2 actually hits live servers, and I also expect more tuning when it does, and with the first week or so of Eternal Palace progression. With that being said, let's get right into this and start off with Destruction. The essence combination that I am eyeing for Destro at this point mostly revolves around Memory of Lucid Dreams as your major essence, and Vision of Perfection as the minor for CD reduction. With Lucid Dreams being at a 2-minute CD now, it lines up very well with your Supremacy window from your Player-Bound Infernal. When pairing it with the VOP Minor and Crashing Chaos trait, you can get your Infernal cooldown to about 2 minutes and 24 seconds or so, and seeing as how you typically pop your Dark Soul and other 2-minute CDs about 10 seconds into that window, this build brings with it a tremendous amount of burst damage every 2 or so minutes. Activating your Lucid Dreams essence with about 18 seconds remaining ensures you get full value out of the bonus shard generation as well right before the window closes. Once activated, it seems as if you're almost casting nothing but Chaos Bolts, which leads to some insane damage pretty deep into your Supremacy window. There's also the option of running Vision of Perfection as your major essence, with Lucid Dreams as the minor, and praying for good RNG, but this build will be far less consistent when it comes to actual damage output. There will be times when you have multiple procced Infernals from Vision of Perfection almost back to back when you have your Player-Bound Infernal active, which grants near a full minute of Supremacy, and then there will be times where you proc no Infernals in 3 minutes, like I have multiple times, and have a dead major essence in a sense. I feel the Lucid Major/VOP Minor build offers a tremendous amount more consistency while bringing with it a great bit of damage every 2 or so minutes. I also feel that Condensed Life Force is a solid option here as well as a major essence. The testing that I did with it also made for some pretty big Supremacy windows with the 10% haste buff and the 5% increased damage taken, but depending on your other essences, it might not sync up with your Inferno window every time, as Life Force is a 3-minute cooldown. Its single target damage output is very respectable at rank 3, but once again, it is gated behind Eternal Palace progression. Crucible of Flame could also be an option here as well. As we mentioned, it does deal a moderate amount of single target damage at rank 3, but I think there are better options here overall for Destruction. At this point, I personally am leaning towards the Lucid Dreams Major with Vision of Protection Minor build with 1 Crashing Chaos trait for consistency. Demonology also has a few new builds at its disposal, but most of the earlier builds that I tested with revolved around Vision of Perfection. Perfection-based tyrants are no longer affected by the Demonic Consumption talent, but do grant 3 Soul Shards, some Baleful Invocation when summoned, and also grant 35% of the Supreme Commander Intellect buff when they expire. In similar fashion to how VOP functions for Destruction, the VOP builds for Demonology also bring with them a lot of RNG. If you're able to proc a Vision-based Tyrant in the setup of your Player-Bound one, you bring a tremendous amount of burst damage in that window with the Supreme Commander buff active, while your Player-Bound Tyrant is also. Even outside of your player-based Tyrants, having a large Intellect buff for a whopping 15 seconds still brings with it a significant DPS boost, and there have been many times where I've had Supreme Commander active for upwards of a minute thanks to good Vision-based Tyrant procs. I also think that Condensed Life Force is a solid bet for Demonology if you don't want to deal with the RNG that VOP brings to the spec. The 10% haste buff that it brings with it means that every other Tyrant you cast will be buffed by it, and the 5% increased damage taken is also very nice to have active during your Tyrant. As far as minor essences go, I like Memory of Lucid Dreams for Demonology a good bit. When paired with Soul Conduit and Demonic Meteor, you can have some insane chains of shard generation to the point where you're barely even casting a Shadow Bolt. It also leads to bigger Tyrants every minute and a half, which further plays into the Condensed Life Force of VOP Lottery Majors. I was a big fan of the Unbound Force, as it initially was granting a stack off of each individual imp that you imploded when it did not crit, but that was fixed pretty early into PTR and has been underwhelming since then. Seeing as how we won't have access to the rank 3 version of Condensed Life Force until later into the Eternal Palace, I'm personally going to look at starting off with a Vision of Protection Major / Lucid Dreams Minor build and go from there. I do also want to experiment a bit more with rank 3 Blood of the Enemy and Condensed Life Force as minors as well when they're available. Last but not least, we have Affliction, and if I'm being honest, Aff was easily the hardest of the 3 specs to really try and lock in on what looks to be good essence combinations. Unlike Destro and Demo, Vision of Perfection as a major essence is actually pretty poor for Affliction. Proccing a Dark Lair for a few seconds and extending your dots by a few really does not do a whole lot outside of your 3-minute CDs. If you're playing an SL build, you will typically end up extending your Agony, Corruption, and Siphon Life by a few seconds, as well as the 1 UA you most likely have rolling on the target. If you're playing Absolute Corruption build, well, you'll extend your Agony by a few seconds and most likely a UA as well, but let's be honest, that's really underwhelming. Vision of Protection is an interesting choice, however, when looking at minor essences for Affliction, as when paired with Dreadful Calling, it puts your Dark Lair in a very similar spot to how Destro is with its Infernal and Dark Soul cooldowns. You should theoretically be able to pair every Dark Lair with Dark Soul running VOP as a minor, with 1 Dreadful Calling Azshara trait. You will probably sit on your Dark Soul CD for a few seconds, but it is certainly worth pairing them together if possible. At the same time, however, you also have Lucid Dreams as a very strong minor essence option, which also appears to be pretty strong for Affliction and makes it so that you aren't really forced into running a Dreadful Calling trait like the previous build speaks of. Just looking at the other major essences we've reviewed though, sort of puts us in a tough spot. VOP is very underwhelming for Aff as mentioned, and we aren't able to take advantage of the Lucid Dreams major on use like we are with Destruction. Blood of the Enemy is a trait that I tested with a good bit, but after the damage percentile / duration nerf it received and factoring in the movement it brings with it, I'm actually not very high on this trait at this point. I think it'll be a decent choice initially, but will fall by the wayside when Condensed Life Force is a thing. Out of the remaining major essences we have tested, this really leaves us with 3 options in a sense. We have Crucible of Flame, which is a decent single target option, but gains a great bit of value at rank 3. We have Condensed Life Force, but that also gains a lot of value at rank 2 and 3. It's also gated behind weeks of Eternal Palace clears, or we have the final option of Worldbane Resonance. Worldbane Resonance being a 1-minute CD means you will have the activation for every Dark Lair depending on the minor essence you select, I suppose, while also benefiting the raid as a whole. If multiple people are running the essence, then it becomes even more powerful for both your damage and the raids in general. Seeing as how it's pretty easy to acquire, I will most likely start off with a build looking at Worldbane as a major, and then either Vision of Protection or Lucid Dreams as the minor. When we get further into Eternal Palace prog, I could easily see making the swap to Condensed Life Force as our major of choice, and honestly, it's just a really powerful essence as a whole. Seeing as how we do acquire Crucible of Flame pretty early on as well in 8.2, I think it's also a solid major option heading into the first few weeks, but as mentioned, it gains a lot of value at rank 2 and 3. Now, most of these essence combinations are in a raid setting, and there are other options such as Focusing Iris and others which would be of more value in Mythic Plus or on AoE based fights like Orgrizoa as mentioned before. Like I also mentioned before, all of these combinations are from my own personal testing on PTR and are what I am looking at as far as builds go for the first few weeks of 8.2. A good bit of essences aren't even available until week 3 or later, and some are sort of worthless until higher ranks, so the first week or so is partially going to be a use what you can acquire kind of week, but overall, I'm really excited for the new essence system and 8.2 as a whole. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to get back to you. If you want to see more WoW content and help support the channel, smash those like, share, and subscribe buttons as your support really helps. Thanks guys, and I'll see y'all in 8.2. Peace.